It took a lot of convincing for my friends to make me try out Final Fantasy XIV, especially since me being generally intimidated by RPGs with hundreds of hours of content has been a running theme throughout my time playing video games. I did eventually give it a go, seeing as Square Enix's free trial is obscenely generous, offering the entire base game and first expansion pack for free, give or take a few features. Although I wasn't exactly blown away by my experience with Final Fantasy XIV, I did finish the base game, coming away from it feeling rather satisfied. Although the game certainly has many faults that are sometimes difficult to put aside, I am under the impression that I have discovered something truly special. Now I do need to give a disclaimer, I have only played a Realm Reborn. I have no idea what happens in the expansions, and I am well aware that quite a lot of the issues I have with the game are eliminated, and quite a lot of the game's qualities are further improved as well. This is strictly a look at the base 2.0 story from a Realm Reborn from a new player's perspective. I'm also aware that this game is frequently updated, and anything I mention in this video is absolutely subject to change in the game itself. This video also includes spoilers for a Realm Reborn, so if you haven't played that yet, I'd recommend doing so before watching this. With that in mind, I hope you get something out of this video, and I'd be especially happy to hear what you have to say in the comments. Something that most fans of the game would mark as an absolute high point for them is the game's story, which I've heard described as both poignant and highly spoiler sensitive. However, A Realm Reborn is universally seen as the narrative weak point of the game, and although I don't know how the expansions play out, I already feel inclined to agree. I first need to explain how I view writing in regards to speculative fiction. I separate them into three categories: scenario, characters, and world setting. Scenario is the game's overall plot, from beginning to end, how it flows, how it's structured, and how it fundamentally works. What's the hook? Twists, holes, conveniences, etc. They're all covered here. Characters involve, well, the characters. How do they grow? How do they change? And how do they develop? Are they entertaining? Their motivations understandable? Their passions defined? And then finally, the world setting, which basically comes down to the world itself. This is the part that is probably most essential to any long-running series, and consistency is key. It's important to have it fleshed out enough to be believable, but without contradicting any of the world's major core rules. The game's writing, I think, is pretty decent overall, though in terms of both scenario and characters, it falters in my experience. I understand that director Naoki Yoshida and the game's myriad of writers were in a bit of a rock and a hard place. After the failure of the game's initial launch, they had to work older players into this new version of the world and reintroduce the characters from 1.0, while also introducing all of it to new players for the very first time, and frankly, that is a monumental task, and I do not envy the creative forces at work here. However, I do think that although the context is important, at the end of the day, the finished art piece speaks for itself, and A Realm Reborn scenario remains fairly unengaging outside of a few key moments. It's not bad necessarily, but it just pulls you every which way and doesn't feel like it has any real stakes until the Waking Sands is raided and the Scions of the Seventh Dawn are captured. I'm not much of an RPG player, so forgive me if this is common in the genre, but I felt that the scenario just kept jerking me around and sending me on little fetch quests that even in-universe felt like they wasted time. And the game is seemingly aware of this, with character Y'shtola Rule directly commenting on this when preparing a feast right before fighting Titan. Even when it's not doing this, which to the game's credit is rather often, it still feels like setup for future expansions and not a self-contained story that has a satisfying beginning, middle, or end. Despite this, it was still mostly fine. There was only one part of the story that actively frustrated me, and that was the character of Thancred Waters, who has a forced face-heel turn when he's possessed by an Ascian and betrays the Scions.
No, this cannot be.
I don't necessarily have an inherent problem with this narrative beat, but it feels oddly hollow rather than emotional, and I think that boils down to the fact that I didn't really feel connected to Thancred at any point beforehand. At the very most, he felt like a chill mentor figure, and I never felt that I developed any special bond with the character that would make such a reveal impactful in the slightest. Your mileage on that will probably vary though, as Thancred does get more screen time if you started in Ul'dah, and I started in Limsa Lominsa, so there is a chance that I'm missing something. Overall, I found the game's scenario to be passable, with a few exciting moments here and there, but otherwise it just felt a bit anemic and a little bit unengaging. There's a great story here somewhere, and I think that's where Square will probably take it when I get to the expansions, but looking solely at a Realm Reborn's base story, I couldn't help but feel underwhelmed.
The adventurer I've seen around Summerford Farms. I thought myself on the trail of the kidnappers, but it would seem I have missed my mark.
The characters do fare a little better. I wouldn't necessarily call them all that great, at least not so far, but they get decent characterization, generally make sense within the context of the scenario and setting, and mostly all have their moments of being entertaining. They require significantly more development to be truly interesting though, with Cid Garland the only one standing out as having any real depth to me. It kind of has the same problem as the scenario, where, to pick a random character as an example, the game says, "Hi, this is Y'shtola. You get to meet her, say hello," but it never really moves past that point. It never really asks, who is Y'shtola? What is she feeling? What are her goals? How does she change? Beyond a surface level. I assume that these are elements that get heavily refined and polished in the expansions, but in A Realm Reborn, it's just not quite there. On the other hand though, I do like the game's antagonist, Gaius von Balsire. He's a little bit generic as far as fascist villains go, but he's fleshed out a bit more than some of the other characters, and I do like how he seems to genuinely believe in his cause rather than just put on a front, which in my opinion makes him a more intimidating villain, though I can't say what Square does with him in the future. There's the groundwork for something truly interesting here, but it just needs work that frankly, Square has probably already done. If there's anywhere where the writing truly shines though, it's in the world setting. This is the element that kept me playing through all 90 hours give or take of the game. The game presents you with a world still reeling from the 5th Umbral Calamity, an ecological disaster of monumental proportions, and even that is an understatement. As you progress through the game's many locations, you get a wonderful sense of the world and the suffering that these people are trying to move on from, their unique struggles as a nation recovering still from unprecedented pain. You see this once bustling world desperately clinging to the past, trying to emotionally rebuild but unable to move on. The lives that were lost, the destruction that was caused, the generational trauma that was inflicted. The game conveys these darker themes with a surprising amount of nuance and empathy for the shared plight of the people, regardless of their nationality, race, or creed. Moving on is difficult, but if we lift each other up, we'll all make it out okay. Rebuilding what was once lost is impossible, but we must move on and not lose hope, and these underlying themes can be felt through even minor interactions in the game. I think a lot of the dialogue is witty and amusing, and the writers did a very good job at making sure even the most menial and stupid of side quests felt like an actual part of the world, and not just, "Adventurer, will you go fetch me 5 wolf pelts? I will give thee 10 gil." Even if the story and characters aren't investing, the world itself is, and to me that was the biggest boon for the game. One of my favorite little moments was when I briefly tried to be a culinarian, and one of the job quests required me to make a traditional Mikote dish called the meat Miko Bob, which amused me to no end. I mean, that's like calling a hamburger a Hume burger. I probably found it much funnier than Square intended it to be. Nevertheless, I wanted to be in Eorzea. I wanted to explore its nooks and crannies and learn more about its strange little denizens. It genuinely carries the game, and I am beyond excited to see how it develops in the expansions. If there was anything I was most hesitant about going into the game, it would have to be the game design. I had heard many stories that MMORPGs were unbearable, addictive grind fests filled with minimum gameplay and maximum tedium. I can't speak for most MMOs, as this was my first, but I found this one to be remarkably competent regarding design. The combat on a 1-to-1 level isn't really all that engaging, and that's true, but when you're playing with other people and you have to assume a role for the rest of the party, especially when you're an important member like a tank, it's a lot of fun, especially when you gradually learn how to best perform this role and you get player commendations as a result. I only really played warrior to any real degree, so I can't speak to how the other jobs play, and who knows, they might be exceptionally more or less fun than my chosen class, but I enjoyed my time with what I played here. The boss fights are thought out pretty well too, with fair yet unique patterns to how they attack, meaning the exact same approach can't always be applicable, even if they aren't particularly challenging on the default difficulty. The only one I struggled with was Cretin, whose fight I felt was a bit unfair with its AoE attacks, which is pretty funny because he used to be known as one of the easiest bosses in the game, or so I'm told. It's not all sunseekers and rainbows though. I mentioned this a little bit earlier in regards to the story, but it applies to the gameplay as well, and that's simply the game's awkward pacing. It feels like sometimes Square didn't really know how to fill out certain sequences, and therefore added quite a few mandatory fetch quests to pad playtime, and this gets painfully obvious at certain points. The most egregious example to me is the aforementioned feast before fighting Titan, which, while explained away in the narrative as the company of heroes testing your resolve, really just reeks of we needed to fill space. Though admittedly, the resulting party is fairly cool. One thing I do appreciate about Final Fantasy XIV is Square consciously deviating from a lot of MMORPG design choices, at least to my understanding of what constitutes an MMORPG. In my experience, grinding, my biggest fear about any RPG, isn't really mandatory in this game at all. Sure, you can absolutely grind to your heart's content if that's what you want, but at no point did the game ever outright require me to. Both the main scenario and the job quests gave me more than enough experience points to be properly leveled for any encounters I'd need to face. In fact, the game gives you more than enough XP to level up all combat classes if you choose. I never bothered with it, but friends have told me it's not a good idea to waste all that XP on just one class. In the 90 hours it took me to beat a Realm Reborn, including time spent piddling around with side content, I had to grind once for 30 minutes to get access to the Glamours mechanic, which, while considered the end game by most players, I don't think is essential for progression. And yeah, it certainly did suck, but half an hour out of nearly 100 is pretty damn good, I'd say. I wouldn't exactly say there's anything about Final Fantasy XIV's game design that is all that exceptional or interesting in the broader sphere of gaming, but I think it does what it's trying to do pretty well, and it remained competent enough to keep my attention throughout the whole playthrough. You'll often hear the phrase, graphics don't matter regarding video games, and I've never been one to agree. A game's visual design gives it identity, it gives off your first impression, and it's your primary means of connecting and immersing yourself within the world. I tend to view graphics within context. I'm very uncomfortable comparing older titles to modern games. I categorize them by these metrics: year of release, platform, and budget, and within the framework of A Realm Reborn being a multi-platform AAA MMO from 2013, I think a lot of it looks really great, especially one that is rooted in what was at the time 3-year-old technology. Now, there is a difference between art direction and technical execution, and I'll be talking about both, as they need to work in tandem for a truly visually satisfying game, but I'd say it's satisfying in both areas. The environments in particular are gorgeous, and it's part of what makes Final Fantasy XIV just such a fun world to exist in, exploring these large areas with such a variety in their moods and visuals. Each area has its own unique identity, and I think Square did a phenomenal job at making sure each area, especially the architecture, felt like it had a real sense of place. They feel like real areas and not just video game levels. From the sands of Ul'dah, to the seas of Limsa, to the forests of Gridania, and the many snowy mountains you'll encounter, there is always something to see and different moods for different people. My favorite area has to be this odd red crystal growth out in the mountains. I just love the idea of something just invading on the natural world and growing like a parasite, yet still ending up oddly beautiful in its own right. The only one that stood out to me as being a bit flat was the sandworm area in the Ul'dah deserts, which probably could use a little more in the way of detail. In the main hub areas, Square put a lot of smaller details into the areas to make them feel like a part of an active, breathing world, such as the Mikote dancers in the streets or workers slaving away above a hot stove. The designs of the creatures that inhabit the world are varied and interesting, and I particularly liked Square's interpretation of the goblins as mask-wearing merchants with big, silly, floppy ears, even if I didn't particularly care for how they were written more often than not. The character designs, while leaning quite a bit into fantasy design tropes, I feel are pretty consistent with one another, and there was never a moment where they felt out of place. Although 14 is my first Final Fantasy game, I can very much appreciate the love that Square puts into the many homages to past games. For example, many of A Realm Reborn's bosses are based on summons from previous games, though with new designs, and had I played said prior games, I would have loved that aspect quite a lot. Well, striking art direction is one thing, but if the technical implementation can't back it, then it all goes to waste. Thankfully, this isn't the case. Final Fantasy XIV runs on a highly modified version of the Crystal Tools engine, which is what the game originally launched with before it was deemed unsuitable for performance and for handling large-scale player counts. Although the game was developed simultaneously for the PlayStation 3, I think it makes very strong use of PC-specific features, such as horizon-based ambient occlusion and screen space reflections, both of which add significantly to the realism of the game world. The game's implementation of HBAO in particular is part of why the interior locations feel as visually grounded as they do, as shadows form properly in the intersections between objects, making them look much less flat. The game's SSR implementation is also rather good for its era, appearing significantly less pixelated and artifacty than even a lot of modern implementations. However, even the best SSR isn't immune to disappearing out of the corners of my screen. There's also a lot of smaller details that I appreciate, such as your player's hair flapping in the wind or visibly becoming wet when raining. Asset quality is generally very good, with character models boasting rather decent detail. However, a big problem with many of the NPCs you'll find in Eorzea is that they all suffer from same-face syndrome. Now I get it. Final Fantasy XIV is a huge game, and even the biggest teams with the highest budgets wouldn't be able to avoid some degree of face reuse. But here, I feel like it's often too common for it not to be at least a little bit immersion breaking. Most of the main characters from A Realm Reborn can easily be recreated in the game's character creator. My friend even made a near one-to-one recreation of Y'shtola for people to take pictures with. Disclaimer, I am not one of those degenerates. Perhaps in the expansions, they have NPCs with more variety, but from what I've personally experienced, it certainly needs some work. If there's anywhere where the game's visuals suffer the most, it has to be the texture work. For the record, that's not to say it's overall bad, but there are many areas where the textures, particularly the ground textures, simply look messy and undetailed. Smaller details I can understand being lower quality. You don't just want to pop the 4K textures everywhere, that's just bad optimization. However, when it's something as consistently present as the ground, I feel like that would be a higher priority regarding selecting asset quality. The game's use of parallax mapping does make these textures a little more defined, but it can't fully escape its low-resolution nature. Some textures on character outfits can appear oddly pixelated as well, appearing almost like sprite art. Granted, Square has been going back and overhauling a lot of armor textures, so this may not be as big of a problem in the future. I should say though, there are many instances where textures are used rather effectively, usually on man-made surfaces, which are not only higher res, but also generally have better materials. The game's anti-aliasing is also rather poor, using an FFXIV implementation which doesn't clean edges very well, especially on distant objects, but overall it's fine enough for what what it's supposed to be. Another point of praise I have for the game's visual presentation is the shadows and how they're rendered. I think they're rather high quality for the era, and the way they dynamically change based on the game's day-night system not only looks great, but the way they cast over environmental geometry and characters is rather impressive, and it happens consistently everywhere throughout the whole game, which once again contributes to the feeling that this is a real world that operates independently of the player's existence. The last thing I want to mention in this category is performance. Generally, this game runs like a dream. I can get 120 FPS or above with maxed out settings in 1440p with no problem under the vast majority of circumstances. However, around the main spawn aetherytes for each major area, the frame rate will easily half, and sometimes even drop below 60. I have a very modern PC with a 3070 Ti, a Ryzen 5 3600, and 32GB of DDR4 RAM, and the game is nearly 10 years old, so I'm confused as to why this would be so taxing, without it being some sort of engine level limitation. If someone in the comments section below could let me know, I'd really appreciate it. I'd like to get to the bottom of that. The final thing I want to mention in this video is the audio. Now, what do I mean by that exactly? Specifically, I'm referring to the game's original soundtrack as well as its voice acting. However, I will be briefly mentioning its sound effects as well. Although Final Fantasy's unique sound and musical texture were created and defined by the legendary Nobuo Uematsu, starting with Final Fantasy XII, different composers started to take the reins and try to fill his rather large shoes. This time around, Masayoshi Soken would be the game's lead composer, a total newcomer to the series, having cut his teeth on games such as Dawn of Mana and Mario Hoops 3-on-3. Many other composers, including Uematsu himself, would end up contributing to 14's soundtrack as well. From what I've been told, many fans were skeptical of how he'd handle the franchise's signature style, but in the modern day, such concerns feel a little silly considering how utterly excellent the game's soundtrack is. Each area of the game is scored perfectly, providing a highly atmospheric experience that feels grand in scale and knows when to reel back for smaller moments. One of my favorite aspects of the soundtrack is how each area has both a day and night theme, with bold, adventurous themes for the daytime and more somber, inquisitive themes for the nighttime. Soken also knows exactly how to push the player into pure height, composing themes that make you want to charge into battle with heroic, reckless abandon. Soken also uses a wide variety of textures in how he scores environments, giving them each a central musical theme that every track follows. For example, the song Salt Swept features instruments that would not be out of place in the finest of pirate films, and the song To the Sun features percussion and acoustic guitars that perfectly capture Thanalan's desert Middle Eastern vibes. You'll even find the odd rock tracks here and there, such as Under the Weight, which features shredding guitars, rhythmic chanting, and guttural sounding vocals. Overall, I just think it's an excellent score that Soken and his fellow composers clearly put a lot of thought, consideration, and effort into. It does exactly what a score should do, and that is to complement the visuals and atmosphere perfectly, underscoring their intended moods and tones with ambitious intent. I can't wait to play more just to hear more of what he's composed. I'd also love to give some attention to a part of the game that I think goes typically underappreciated when it comes to audio design, and that's the game's amazing sound effects. It sounds like a very minor thing to talk about, but it added significantly to my immersion in Eorzea's many landscapes. The Foley work is insane, capturing many smaller details as they waft through the game's 5 surround channels. It's hard to put into words, but why do that when you can just give it a listen yourself? The last aspect I want to touch on is A Realm Reborn's voice acting. Now, I'm aware that criticizing this is a bit of a dead horse and feels especially irrelevant nowadays considering most of the roles were almost immediately recast afterwards. Nevertheless, this is all new to me, and this is a video about my first time playthrough, isn't it? Looking at all the performances, the most I can really say is that their voices are at the very least fitting for their characters' designs. Generally, however, each actor gives the extreme impression of reading directly from the script.
The Maelstrom has kept a watchful eye upon the beast tribes, and the kobolds in particular, ever since.
Each time they speak, it sounds like they're orating a half-rehearsed speech, which is fine when they actually are, but it makes drama and general conversation feel stilted and awkward, partially stifling emotional impact.
Unfortunately, the only force known to have bested him, the modestly named Company of Heroes, disbanded 5 years since, and mercenaries are not in the habit of keeping chronicles.
This is a shame because a lot of the game's dialogue is written rather strongly. It's just not performed with the conviction or emotional nuance they require to be effective. To me, the worst offender was Amy Bolton as Minfilia, who just comes off as inexperienced and disinterested, which makes sense as A Realm Reborn is her only credited acting role as far as I can tell. I also found Richard Epcar to lean too much into large ham territory when voicing Gaius, which I suppose is fitting for his character, but it just came off as cheesy at points where it should have come off as intimidating.
Your gods are no different from those of the beasts. Icons, everyone. Except but this, and you will see how Eorzea's faith is bleeding the land dry.
However, I don't want to just focus on the negative, because there are actually some fairly decent performances in here too, though unfortunately they're typically for characters who don't get a whole lot of screen time, such as Steve Staley as Papalimo and Gideon Emery as Yuri Anger, both of who I felt embodied their characters well and with a lot more confidence than the rest of the cast. The other performances, which I haven't mentioned, didn't really strike me as particularly great or terrible, just rather mediocre and stilted for the most part. I've actually seen some of these actors in other games give pretty convincing performances, so I think it just might come down to the voice direction for a lot of them. Unfortunately, I wasn't a fly on the wall during the recording sessions, so I suppose I'll never know. A Realm Reborn is not a perfect game by any means. In my experience, it struggles with storytelling, pacing, and some elements of its presentation, and those flaws can be difficult to ignore. Despite this, however, I cannot discount the fact that I had a great time with this game overall. In the nearly 100 hours I've spent in Eorzea's many landscapes, interacting with its characters and fighting its many battles, I've been welcomed by the game's warm community and I've made many memories while playing. The strong world building, decent gameplay, great visuals, and utterly fantastic score kept me hooked while playing, and I know that I've found something truly special. It's difficult to give a game like this a rating, as it's the first of its kind I've ever played, but if I had to, just to easily summarize my thoughts, I'd give A Realm Reborn's base 2.0 content a 7 out of 10. It was pretty good, and I don't regret a single minute I spent on it. I'd also like to dedicate this video to the friends that originally pushed me to play this game to begin with, as if it weren't for you, I wouldn't have taken the plunge and experienced it at all. And of course, thanks to you, the viewer, for giving me a chance to explain my feelings about the game. Hopefully I can produce more content about this game, as well as many other games and even films in the future. So thank you for watching.